Hi there, and welcome to the Change Creation and People Make It Work panel. We've brought this panel together today to help us all to think about ways in which we can respond to these extraordinary times. As a cultural sector, we are naturally all reeling from the complex range of challenges that we're experiencing today, both personally, organisationally, socially, economically, nationally and internationally. We're certainly in unprecedented times. So we've asked some of our friends if they would spend some time with us and help us think together about some of the challenges that are coming ahead. And I'm going to introduce each of them, and then I'm going to ask them to share some initial thoughts, perhaps 5 minutes each, before I then go on to spend perhaps 10 minutes with each of those speakers, going into a little bit more depth and exploring some of the questions that we've all got on our lips and fingertips. So Change Creation is a cultural sector development programme for 40 cultural organisations and 60 leaders. And People Make It Work is a cultural consultancy working to support cultural organisations to change and develop, with 50 associates who work across art form and across the country. Our panel today is extraordinary, and we're delighted to welcome Kate Fielding, who's the former head of communications at the Natural History Museum, who will be helping us to think a bit about internal and external communications. We're hoping Philippa Adela, who's head of HR from Freeze, will also be joining us. As we went live, she was still in another meeting, so we might see her during our session today. If we do, she'll be talking about people support and implications for us and our teams and the wider range of people who are our workforce and volunteers. Anna Dinnan, who has a career spanning Arts Council and Nesta, and she'll be helping us think a bit about stabilisation measures, as well as thinking through the changes through a lens of innovation. Karen Turner, who's Exec Director at the National Youth Theatre and former Managing Director of ICA, and she's going to be helping us think a bit about our cash flow protection and our business models at this time. Caroline McCormick's joining us from Acates Philanthropy, and Caroline will be talking to us about how we engage with funders and patrons right now, and how that might shift the way that we might be fundraising, the kind of case for support, and how that might evolve. And finally, David Micklem, former leader at Battersea Art Centre, one of the founders of 64 Million Artists. And David will be helping us think a bit about how artists and our communities might, what they might need from change at this moment. So the first stage of this conversation, I think, is for me to ask Kate if she would share some initial thoughts with us, perhaps 5 minutes, to just help us understand how this situation looks from her perspective. Over to you, Kate.
Thanks very much, Richard. So just to say and reiterate what Richard said, these are obviously very strange times. We're all facing a pretty unprecedented situation. So I think it's great for us to be able to talk and to share ideas and thoughts and expertise in this moment. In terms of my background, as Richard said, I was, until the summer, I was at the Natural History Museum. Part of my role there included dealing with crisis communications. And during that time, I oversaw our management of issues, including the death of Dave the Worm. We dealt with a car crash on Exhibition Road that was thought to be a terrorist incident for the first 24 hours. And other challenges, including protests against a Saudi embassy event. So I've had experience dealing with quite a range of different crises and issues in terms of the communications. But what I thought might be quite useful is just to spend a few minutes now thinking about the particular nature of this crisis, because obviously everything that we deal with in the sense is very different. And firstly, and most obviously, this is a public health emergency. And really what that means is that it's not about any individual or organisation. It is a situation, like, in reality, we are all in this together, and that's not very often the case. So that's a comforting factor in a way, but it does have a few implications. So one is that this is affecting people at a global level. That's relevant to our organisations which operate globally. It's relevant to our people who have international connections. Because it's affecting everyone, there is a pretty unprecedented dominance of the news agenda. So it does mean that there is an absolute focus on this crisis, and again, not on any individual or organisation. So unlike many crisis situations, you as individuals, you as organisations are not facing criticism or hostile media. But you do need to be thinking about filtering everything through that lens. So there's certainly no opportunity as things stand to talk about other stories at national level. I think with trade media at some point that will shift, it will change, but nonetheless you need to kind of have that lens in front of everything. I think the second key point is about because of the public health situation, the requirements for social distancing, for some groups to self-isolate, we're all getting used to a very different way of working. We're getting used to this kind of remote hookups. A lot of people who have never worked from home before are having to kind of accommodate to that. Obviously, many of our organisations and venues are now shut. So there's a lot of practical implications, firstly around kind of bringing together your crisis comms effort and managing the team in different ways. And also just thinking about how those things and that new distance is going to affect the way that you're engaging with your external audiences as well. I think that the final thing perhaps to say is just, as in any communication, any crisis situation, effective communications are really fundamentally important, and so that does need to be something that is front and centre of your minds as leaders in organisations, and that you are making a focus of your leadership team's efforts and thinking at this time.
Great, thank you so much for those opening thoughts, and it's so useful to kind of move out of our own organisational lens, I think, and kind of just have that perspective that you've brought right away about how this is a distinctive moment. I'm going to ask Anna Dinnan if she would like to offer her opening comments next. So Anna, what does this look like for you?
Hello, hi. So I suppose just like to explain a little bit why I'm coming from a stability perspective, which seems very much a foreign concept right at this particular moment. And in fact, it harks back to work that I did when I was at Arts Council England working in what we then called the stabilisation unit, which subsequently became a team focused on organisational development. And actually that kind of concept of stabilisation, we fairly quickly, after a few years of practice in this area, just thought this is a there is no such thing as a stable organisation, and change tack a little bit on that. But part of our work was also around recovery and turnaround. And in fact, we dealt with a significant number of organisations that were in that situation. And when we first started talking about this, I have to say it kind of made me leap back to those days. Like, oh, we're going back to some kind of 20 years now or something like that. But it made me really think that we're working with a generation, you know, certainly people who are under the age of 40 or 35, who've never had a situation of needing to respond at scale to this kind of, you know, these sorts of issues, and to be reactive in this kind of way at this scale. Sorry, so that was a real moment of realizing actually that we've not practiced or sort of used those recovery muscles quite in the same way. We obviously have as individual organisations, and it's not to say that this hasn't happened for individuals as well, but definitely on a kind of sector level. So there's some real challenges, and I think the Arts Council's responded quite quickly to that, and I'm sure there'll be more. But so I think that's interesting, and I was also then comparing the context in which that recovery had happened. It's very, very different. So what I'd like to share today is obviously based, if you like, rooted in that kind of practice, but acknowledging some very real differences between the circumstances then and today. So I suppose that one of the key things that I learned through that was that the most important thing was to help people move from back foot to front foot thinking as fast as you possibly could. You obviously have to kind of go through the stages, but that mindset shift from being reactive, responsive, trying to kind of literally sort of brace yourself against the tide of new news and new stuff and new decisions to make, and put people in a position where they have drawn a breath in the middle, they've kind of stood on 2 feet, to then looking forward and thinking about opportunity. And that's a really tough journey to go on, but really important. One of the tools that we used to have in mind, which I think some of the cohort may have discussed, is this kind of the Kubler-Ross grief cycle. Is actually the recovery cycle is very, very similar to that. You know, I think we all recognize in ourselves these moments of sort of shock paralysis and needing to move out of that, but maybe you hear yourself express thoughts of anger, of like, why aren't the government doing more, or why haven't they made this decision, or, you know, that kind of thing. And then going on to the whole bargaining thing around, well, we could do that if they did this and we did that. And all of these things are really, they're really real through that recovery process, and really important to acknowledge. And I suppose one of the things that we learned through that process is there's a distinction for organisational leaders, chairs, as well as senior managers, that you might accelerate through that curve, but you've got people behind you who will be moving at very different paces across the organisation. And perhaps some people who you thought might cope really well might struggle a little bit more and take longer to move through the successive stages. So I think it's really useful to have that in your frame of reference and to be thinking about it. I suppose just in the very first moments, I'm sure we'll go on to talk about this a bit more, but you know, I think one of the things you can do for yourselves is get into a low power mode as quickly as you possibly can. So looking at what's non-essential spend, but also non-essential use of time and attention. So time and attention, which is now a really critical kind of resource. So getting into low power mode as quickly as you possibly can. And the other thing is around the possibility of trying to create something like an air pocket, like this little moment in time where you have like whatever's right for your organization, but say a 10-day, 2-week, 3-week period in which you can kind of ground yourselves, give yourself a little bit of a window in which you can then do all the taking stock, work out where you are, what your options are. And what we definitely found is that these tiny little daily decisions, they rack up as much pain as one big decision over that 2 or 3 week period. So if it's possible to try and make that kind of decision to get you onto the sort of 2 feet sort of approach, that would be really, really helpful. There's nothing worse than sort of having this daily battering ram and feeling like you've got to respond on a day-by-day kind of basis. So, so if you can create that kind of little air pocket, work out what you've got in the bank, work out if you need to seek professional advice, all that kind of stuff, that would be a really good place to start.
Great, thank you so much for those opening thoughts. I really love the idea of the air pocket, like that breathing space, that envelope that enables us to kind of make another set of decisions. And I really like the idea of low power mode as well. Like, how do we get down to that level that you know, as quickly as possible, that we're not burning through resources. At this stage, I'd like to ask Karen if she could share her opening comments. I'm sure we'll be hearing more from both Kate and Anna in a little while. Karen, how does this look to you from your perspective?
Thank you. Well, all I can say is what we're doing at National Youth Theatre currently, and how different clients that I'm working with are preparing. And I think there's probably some commonality in the points that have already been covered, but I think I've got a list here. I was very much working up to the minute of joining, so the list is on my screen, so forgive me that I'm looking in that direction. So very much from the micro to the macro, what is it that NYT are doing? What is it that all arts and cultural organisations could and should be doing? I think as a priority, number one, is to get on the front foot financially. Know and understand your immediate financial position and be clear on the absolute detail of that. What cash have you got in the bank? Begin to adjust your organisational thinking and processes to think about preparing a daily and weekly cash flow, but probably initially daily. I think just understanding and having a real clarity of that knowledge, knowing when your regular payments are due, when things are going to go out, reprofiling to allow for income that will almost immediately change for many organisations. And I think in your profiling, make sure that you're allowing for the worst case scenarios should your income directly be affected immediately. I think the second thing I'd say is there's another layer to that sort of more forensic prep, which is thinking about all of your contracts across the organisation. I don't mean to scaremonger in relation to staff, but I'm thinking about whether it's something you were contracted to do or whether it's something that you have contracted others to do. Just looking at what options you have to control expenditure, to postpone and to protect income on your terms. What, again, can you model the impacts of that over time? And what we would say there, I think, is think about your organisational values, and I'm sure this will come up time and time again, your organisational values and your priorities and your ethics. Which takes me to point number 3, which is really on a daily basis now, thinking about controlling the cash that is leaving your bank. So not just know what's in the bank, but control what's going out. Prioritise. Many organisations are finding the checkbooks instead of moving straight to a digital payment. A checkbook allows the bank the money stays in your bank normally for 1 or 2 weeks longer. So using checks instead of immediate digital payment. But again, prioritising the money going out, thinking about the companies and the individuals in your supply chain that will be the hardest hit by what's happening currently. Thinking about the freelance, the sector, the artists, the creatives versus perhaps the bigger companies that can survive the hit for longer. So a question of priorities. I think my 4th point is don't do this on your own. Don't run it on your own. Form a working group, inform your board, get a senior management team working group or a staff working group, whatever's appropriate for the scale and size of your organisation. And within that, know from the outset that it will be the job of that working group to make the difficult decisions. Avoiding difficult decisions, postponing difficult decisions is simply stacking up problems and bottlenecking issues for later. So making decisions as early as you possibly can, however difficult that seems, however unparalleled and unimaginable that those decisions might seem, will save and protect resources and strengthen your immediate resilience for a little bit further down the line. I think my fifth point would be to communicate really early with stakeholders and funders, and I'm sure this will come up later, so I won't spend too long on it. But Arts Council, as we know, have preempted their messaging. They've relaxed grant conditions for portfolio for MPOs. London funders have also got a growing list of trusts and foundations that are saying that they're ready to help. So communicating honestly and openly and well and soon. If you're an income-led organisation that has cancelled events or cancelled programmes, cancelled courses, whatever it might be, think about the way that you're messaging that. Ask people to consider turning payments for tickets, events, courses into donations. Can they gift aid that? Can they gift aid something? Can they postpone payment or postpone a refund? So holding on to cash for as long as possible. Obviously, if this is an individual that really needs that money back, there should be no questions. So again, back to ethics, back to values, back to priorities. But setting up your donations pages front and centre on your website, setting up your core comms front and centre on the website is key. I think the next thing is a little bit more positive. So be proactive. There are some positives, there will be some, there will be many, but we just can't always see them straight away. At National Youth Theatre, we are absolutely looking for the positives. We are being flexible, creative, dynamic, thinking about everything that we deliver and how that can be reconfigured to maintain continuity. We're thinking about the generation of young people that we're currently working with from 11 to 25. They've got crisis in their lives that's unprecedented. So how can we continue to be an organisation that is there for them creatively, that stretches and challenges them when all other structures have basically dissolved around them. So be dynamic. The next point, follow all professional government and sector advice and claim everything you can as early as you can. Nominate one person in the team to be combing all the government announcements, all the local authority, all the sector announcements. Look for the rebates, claim early for gift aid, claim early for any tax relief that you might be able to be due later normally, and check Charities Commission as well for guidelines, any sector advice daily. Just got a couple more.
Go on.
Talk to your teams, be really honest and really open about the situation, whether you're a large organisation or a small. Show leadership and make sure that each individual, something Anna said about grief, make sure each individual has accepted the change that they need to make. They might be so lost in their own world and how it's impacting them. Acknowledge that we're all on a different cycle, so make sure they've heard the key points. Make sure they really understand how what they have to change. Consider your role in your own community and your broader sector community. How can you help? What role can your organisation play that is positive? Whether you're a location-based organisation that can have your doors open, be vibrant in your own location. For us, that's Islington. We're considering that. But also, what does it mean for your community of stakeholders and the young people, in our case, that we're looking after and serving? And my final point would be, let go of normal. Let go of that business plan. Let go of yesterday. Let go of all that list of activity that was all stacked up into this wonderful modest surplus at the end of the year. The sooner you let go of what you knew, the quicker you can help everyone else to adjust, and the quicker the acceptance will enable quicker control, quicker creativity, dynamism and recovery, and hopefully will allow creativity to lead a way out of this for everyone.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I'm feeling the value from this conversation from the three of you already. I'm feeling the value so much, and I'm knowing the Change Creation Gang, as well as our wider clients that People Make It Work and across the sector, I can really see how helpful it is to hear these words this time. So thank you so much. Could I ask Caroline to share your initial thoughts, Caroline, before we move into some questions?
Of course, and firstly, welcome to everybody watching, listening, sending you all very good wishes at this time. I've always been really proud to be a fundraiser and really proud to work in the cultural sector And it seems to me that we're needed more now than ever. So please keep up the good work you're doing. It's probably just worthwhile saying that like Kate, I was at the Natural History Museum for a number of years. I was the fundraising director there and built the £70 million Darwin Centre. I then moved to be head of the head office of the World Writers Association, PEN, where I had 145 offices in 105 countries. And of course, that was a 4-day-a-week job. So I was also a consultant 1 day a week, as well, advising 2 Nobel Peace Prize laureates. So in those jobs, I have really had to deal with some of the most difficult situations you can imagine. At PEN, we were, of course, advising organisations like the UN and UNESCO on writers under threat. And of course, very sadly, you would lose writers under our watch all the time. So we have some experience of dealing with this kind of scenario. 6 years ago, I set up my company, Katie's Philanthropy, which really tries to support the cultural organisations that we work with across the country and increasingly internationally to essentially be brilliant at not only creating or curating art, but also at connecting with audiences. So really my advice stems from that approach that we take at Katie's Philanthropy, which is an audience-informed approach. Really in terms of treating funders as part of our close communities of friends at this time, with whom we have an honest and transparent dialogue. Many cultural organisations, as we know, and in particular larger organisations, have heavily relied on what we call transactional fundraising to date. So they will have offered benefits in return for support. Now, obviously, as our world has changed immensely, so that system rapidly needs to change as well. I would argue that that is actually a change that's long overdue, that taking our place as charities which have a meaningful impact in the world and are valued in a variety of different ways is something that's really critical. And this time is certainly going to accelerate that process. So it's essential that even though the usual nature of your relationship with donors is about to change substantially, that your organisation distinguishes itself by the warmth, the positivity of its tone, and the personal nature of the approach, and by building a virtual community around you. The reality of the funding landscape, which is held up from everything from the private investment in culture surveys, the latest Catalyst Evolve data, and even the Katie's Philanthropy Prize submissions, which we receive every year, show very clearly that individual giving is growing, and even very small success organisations can be very successful at this. But strategies in how to do this are not always successful, and that we do need to really drill down in this area and make those strategies as robust as they can be. Often we're very passive in waiting for people to come to us. Trusts and foundations, they will be fundamentally working largely with the assets that they gained last year. So their funds for this year are secure because they'll be working from those dividends, but really obviously what we're conscious of is the fact that those dividends, even though they're probably largely for the bigger trusts held in bonds, will be hit for next year. So we're already at Katie's seeing an influx of bid writing support being requested because people are seeing very much that that's an area that they can progress with at this time. Obviously, as been noted already by Anna, I think there is increasing movement in the sector in terms of those trusts coming together, making sure that their grants are being opened up in terms of how they're used, and communicating clearly with those trusts and foundations about our position is really key. The position with corporates has been challenging for some time. In the private investment in culture survey in 12 to 16, we saw corporate support of the arts drop by nearly a third. That position was slightly better in the last private investment in culture survey, but it's very difficult to see all the factors underlining that. And I would say that what's critical at this time is retaining presence and vibrancy so that we can attract as many corporate supporters back into the sector as we can when this really challenging period is over. In the day-to-day world, what we do is we present art and we surround that art with a series of curated campaigns, selling tickets, engaging supporters, etc., etc. And whilst I absolutely take Anne's point about stepping away from the normal, there is a reason why we approach things in that way. And I think that what we're recommending is that to a degree, you think about how you might transfer that model into a virtual environment. So we would really recommend that people don't simply put up an appeal without demonstrating their meaning, their value, and their impact. We are really encouraging people to think about ways in which they can continue to fulfill their charitable purpose, their public benefit, and progress that at this time. Don't put out an appeal just for your organisation, put out an appeal for the value of the work that you do, if you have to do one. And really think about how you can continue to play a meaningful role. And then alongside that, curate campaigns, just as you would do, some of which will be information-based, and some of which, particularly with regards to individual donors, you'll be thinking about a period of time, essentially probably till around July, that you're thinking, what are the messages we're trying to get across in this period? What's our frequency of contact, and how are we going to create that message over the period of time? So that's really the process that we're working on with our clients, is that dual parallel process of how is the art and the public benefit going to be maintained, and alongside that, the campaigning to retain and build support.
Great, thank you so much. So useful. David, I wonder if you could step into the limelight at this stage and share some views, perhaps from your perspective at 64 Million Artists, thinking about creative cultural democracy, your background at Battersea Arts Centre, and your independent work that you do today.
Great, thank you. And thank you for the chance to speak in these very challenging and fast moving times. It's great to see you all that I can see here, and I hope that people watching online are getting something from what we're all saying. I've got a few notes, so apologies if my eyes are drifting off to my right, but I want to make sure I get my points across. And I wanted to really start off with asking us all to engage in a thought experiment. So it's going to take about 5 minutes, this thought experiment, but please bear with me. And that is that we'll somehow pull through this financially. That's the thought experiment I want us to adopt. That the Arts Council and local authorities and trust fund foundations and the government will support us through this crisis. That at the end of the day, the cost of arts and culture is too small, its impact too great to let go. So it's a thought experiment, and I just want you to come with me on that journey for 5 minutes or so. That's not to say we're not going to have to make significant changes and lose staff and deal with unimaginable challenges and rewrite the rule books, all of that and more. But for a few minutes, let's just assume that our backers back us. So now I'd like to break this crisis down into 3 phases as I see it. And this is really just a personal reflection, very much on the hoof. So the first phase is planning. The second is phase 2, complete lockdown, a new kind of model. And phase 3 is out the other side. And I'm going to briefly talk to each of those phases. So phase 1, planning, that's the next few weeks. As the grip of the virus takes hold, what are we going to do? Not for ourselves, but I think for the communities we exist to serve. What do they need, and what can we offer? Let's find new ways of talking to them, like this, through Zoom conferences with our stakeholders, or chat rooms with young people, or with our audiences, or with the vulnerable in our communities. Let's think about what skills we have on our teams. Let's do an audit of the excellent communicators, the creative thinkers, the artists, the experts working with young people or the hard to reach. What can we do as civic organizations that are by, with, and for communities? So phase 1, as I see it, is emergency planning, communicating, and absolutely critically listening to what it is our communities need. It's a democratic approach to finding out what our communities need and how. What can we do that others can't, that the NHS can't, that local authorities can't? And by that, I mean nothing is off the table. We're listening to everyone inside our organizations and out. That's phase 1. I'm imagining it's 2 weeks. Phase 2, complete lockdown and a new kind of model. So this is the new normal. This could be from April to June, or it could be from April to September, or it could be for the rest of the year. Nobody knows. And a reminder, just we're not thinking about the money just for a moment. Let's keep thinking about what this phase might be like. Let's go back to our core purpose. What do we really exist to do? How do we apply this in completely new territory? How do we partner others to share what we're doing? Other arts organisations, local authorities, the NHS. How does a sector that thrives on collective creativity maintain and develop its role in times of great crisis? How do we use our skills in new ways for the same ends? And I guess if I think about my old gaff, Battersea Arts Centre, and its mission, which is to inspire people to take risks, to shape the future. So to inspire people to take creative risks to shape the future. I think about how that mission might swiftly adapt to support online and real world creativity across Wandsworth, the borough in which Battersea Arts Centre is, across London and around the UK. So this is phase 2, and it's a completely new kind of delivery anchored in our organisational mission and values. We're making it up as we go along, retaining a nimbleness, an innate creativity, an ability to change our minds, to experiment. There are no right or wrong ways of doing things. There are no rules. We're in completely uncharted waters. But we're highly skilled and dynamic, and we're trusted in our communities. And if we have that clear sense of purpose that I just mentioned, I think we've got a real opportunity to thrive. I was reading this morning about Eden Court, which many of you will know, up in Inverness, and its emerging plans to work with the Highland Council to co-create some new interventions for the people of that part of Scotland. So just briefly, 3 examples from them. Their engagement team, who work with children, young people and the community, are going to collaborate with Highland Councils on learning outcomes for the whole of that region. Secondarily, many of the Eden Court staff members have experience of working with vulnerable groups. They're going to look to deploy those in different ways across that region. And then staff members are going to develop plans to tackle loneliness over the coming weeks and months. So 3 emerging ideas from an organisation that's going right back to kind of first principles. What do we exist to do, for whom and how? So it's vision, mission and values. And I'm seeing emerging plans at this very early stage up and down the country. So that's phase 2, the new normal. And then very quickly, I'm nearly out of time, phase 3. And that's out the other side. And I just guess I'm wanting us to keep an eye on the longer term whilst we're also thinking about those immediate challenges. What might life be like on the other side of this crisis? Remember, this is a thought experiment, and we're imagining that somehow the finances work. And I know it's not as easy as just saying that, but let's just bear with me for a minute and a half longer. The finances work. So what are we doing? Maybe it's June of this year, or it's September, or it's this time next year. No one knows what the world will be like, but eventually this crisis will come to an end, and the world in which we operate will be a different place. So what role might we play in that world? What function does arts and culture have in a world that might have been locked down for months and months and now is emerging, blinking into the light? How do we exploit the value of our collective creativity within our communities? What have we learned from the lockdown about each other and about our communities and what their needs and wants are? How can we bravely be different in this new world and not just resort to old and possible tired patterns of behaviour? My sense is that arts and culture and creativity, that uniquely human approach to life, will be far more needed on the other side of this crisis than ever before. Isolation from each other, from the collective, will bring with it a realization that we need one another and the invention and entertainment that sits at the heart of our sectors. And we all know this, we're social animals, and art and culture are innately social. If arts and culture help us make sense of the world, what role might it have in a world that's radically altered forever? And just a few final thoughts, just 20 seconds, and then I'm done. I've got to say, I admit to being frightened. I'm frightened for my family, my aged parents, my friends and colleagues here and around the world. And I'm frightened for what this invisible virus might do to our vulnerable communities, to our economy, our society, to arts and culture. But, and it's a big but for me at the moment, I also have to admit to being excited about the role that we might all play in this. And I mean that now in phase 1, soon in phase 2, and later in phase 3, when we're on the other side and we're changed forever.
Thank you, David. So I feel, I'm personally feeling as a result of those opening comments, like we've got an extraordinary panel with us today, and that there's extraordinary wisdom in this room, in this virtual room, and that indeed it's only matched by the wisdom that we witness in our organisations across the country, in our communities. I wonder whether at this stage it'd be useful, Kate, if we kind of dug into some of the conversations that we've had. Maybe you've got some reflections on what you've heard so far from the rest of the panel, because I made you go first. And then maybe we might ask a question about sort of what do you recommend people should do next or should have done already. So should we start with a question about what you've heard or what you've noticed across the comments that have come from the other panelists, and then take you into that question about sort of recommendations?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think so much of what the other panelists have said was really resonating with me. And you know, I think this is all part of one effort. So, I mean, taking Anna's comment, and you picked up on it, Richard, about the need to kind of take a breath, take a step back occasionally from new news. And I think that's really relevant even for your communications team, who obviously have to stay very much plugged into the news and what's happening. But one of the things, you know, that I was thinking about in preparing for this in terms of the principles and the important things to bear in mind for any crisis situation, I think one of the key ones, and it's an easy one to overlook when you kind of jump into the detail of dealing with all the maelstrom of things that are happening around you, is to have a clear objective. And actually to think about what you're trying to do at any particular time. I think that probably over the course of this situation is going to develop in the early stages, and in a way kind of picking up David's like different stages of this. Right now, we need to be aware of all of the feelings that are going on for our own people internally, and in the wider communities that we engage with. And so the primary thing has to be about reassuring people and getting them the information that they need at the time that they need it. And so it's quite basic. We need to do all the things other people talked about. They need to be proactive, and to kind of get out there to try and be very responsive, have a lot of two-way communications and open channels, share ideas, listen to people's concerns. But I think as this progresses and as it develops, clearly there will be opportunities to think and to engage in different ways. I think some of the things that people said clearly about your purpose, your values, your fundamental role as an organisation, and actually the ways that can come to the fore through this is really, really important. Sorry, I've lost my thread. That sense that you can build a community actually as you go, and refocus people on that bigger purpose that organisations in the cultural sector have, the things that we can do that make a difference at this time. And building kind of long-term, so it's focusing, being values-led and demonstrating our value, and that's going to build long-term relationships, which will be so important when we turn to thinking about how to come out the other side of this. I think one thing that I would say is that there are very definitely there's kind of first order and second order concerns. And although a lot of the people who are in leadership positions within organisations will rightly have some enormous concerns about the financial implications of this, I think the principle in any crisis is always be human, and that means thinking about people first, nothing trumps safety. That's always the priority. And we do need to think carefully about what's the right time to have conversations, to introduce messages about financial concerns. Albeit that will certainly, and internally, people will be very concerned and will want to talk about, the stability and the viability of the organisations. Yeah, I think that's some of the sort of the principles and picking up on the points that other people have made.
Thank you. And are there some resources that that are out there, in the world, online, that people might, that you might recommend that people access in particular to support them as they're developing their external and internal comms plans and responses?
Yeah. I think one thing to say is that obviously in terms of the actual kind of public health information, it's really important to be pointing to all of the official sources of information. So you and most people, I imagine, will at this stage already have bookmarked, but the kind of the core information sources, so gov.uk, nhs.uk, Public Health England and World Health Organization, everything, and any instruction should always be just signposting back to them. So nobody needs to kind of get into being a health expert at this stage. In terms of advice and information, so NCVO has got a really good page bringing together lots of local government association. Similarly, has got lots of really useful information collated. I can share links to those if that's helpful. For internal comms, if anyone's sort of thinking about that, there's a really great blog called All Things I See. And that's done quite a few roundups of specific information about this crisis, and also more generally just how to kind of engage internal audiences in tricky times.
And have you got a sense of who you think, and it's so early in, it's so early in this latest phase of the crisis, although it's been, coming and developing over some time. Have you seen some organisations that have been doing particularly well, that have got that authenticity, that clarity, that authority, I suppose, that we've been talking about, and have kept that focus on people and the human in their communications during this time?
Yeah, I think there's a few. I guess you asked a little bit earlier about what people should be doing now, and so I suppose I'm going to answer both together.
Yeah.
I think one of the things that people need to do, if possible, is get answers to specific information that people need up front as much as possible. So I've seen some good examples where people have put out statements where they're announcing the closure, but they've actually kind of used that opportunity to tell people the basic information about, look, this is what's going to happen with refunds. I think also to indicate if you are closing an initial period of time that's going to apply for, even if that's going to be reviewed, it just helps to give a little bit of certainty around an initial phase. Another thing that I think people should be doing now should be pulling in any planned or scheduled marketing and communications, adverts. I have seen organisations trip themselves up with stuff going out in the early phases of advice changing. There were adverts that were going up with a kind of, events that had a very unfortunate tone around them. And because things are moving so fast, I think you need to kind of have eyes over that almost on a daily basis. Something that kind of looks right today may not look right tomorrow. So just that additional kind of scrutiny over everything, I think is really important. There are, yeah, I think there are some good examples of people who've done really nice things. So actually, I mean, we were talking earlier about Leon. You mentioned that they are kind of doing half-price food for people working in the NHS. There's a couple of organisations that have done that. Completely outside the sector, I've been really impressed by Sainsbury's. Mike Coop has been sending emails. I think they've had a really great tone to them. He's a sort of a known figure. He leads from the front, and that's been really visible in what he's put out there, and the way in which they've talked about the need to kind of pull together, and they've sort of treated their customers as part of the family, and had that open conversation with them. I think the National Trust has kind of really played a blinder over this decision to open parks and gardens for free. I've seen a really fantastic response to that. And obviously, you know, that points to what some of the other panelists were saying about, you know, let's have a think about what we as organisations can do to benefit our communities at this moment. Some quick thinking. Watford Palace Theatre, I noticed their closure announcement was actually used to advertise a digital commission. It's fantastic, sort of very fleet of foot, pointing to their kind of plans to carry on through this. And I really like Tate's, again, sort of thinking about that, going back to your purpose. They talked about the way that they were going to continue to share the joy of art through this period, which I thought was lovely. So yeah, fundamentally, you know, those organisations that are kind of living their brand values, they're kind of putting up front their bigger purpose and mission. They're focused on what they can do for others, and not necessarily, certainly at the moment, on their own concerns and worries.
Thank you. Kate, it's been brilliant to have you with us today. Please hang around if you can, stay in that top bar and hear the rest of the conversation. Really appreciate everybody joining us today for free to share their knowledge and experience, their incredible wisdom with the sector, with change creation and the cultural sector beyond. So thank you so much for that. And I'm going to ask Caroline McCormick to join me now to move into the next conversation. And Caroline, from Katie's Philanthropy, it's brilliant. It's already been brilliant to have you in this digital room with us. What's your take on the conversations that you've heard so far? And you know, what are some of the, you talked already about some of the things that you thought people needed to do, but where might we suggest people move next in terms of their actions in your area?
Thank you, Richard. It's a pleasure to be with you all. I really recognise what was being talked about earlier in terms of the Kubler-Ross curve, and I suppose my job is to make sure that whilst people need to go through that process, that I'm helping them to move towards the next steps of planning in that. I think Kate just mentioned a number of reactions that we've seen. I think I've seen some really brilliant reactions from people like Theatre 503, fantastically warm email from them, which just made me and all my team immediately want to give. I think I've seen some less good reactions from people like, sorry, perhaps I won't go into the names of the bad ones, but more corporate reactions. And even where people have been signposting that you might still be able to engage with their work, doing it in quite a remote, passive way, go and look at our archive, etc., as opposed to really supporting people in having that journey of exploration. I suppose at the moment what we're really doing is essentially working closely with our clients to put this two-pronged process in place. So how are they continuing to present their work and to live their values? And secondly, how can we, in response to that, support them in the specialist dialogue, the communications campaign with their audiences? So in terms of my top tips, you won't be surprised at all that the very first one really is, as others have said, live your values. For us, organisations that are charities need to be purpose-led. And very often we find that where organisations are going wrong is they're inwardly focused on their own ability to survive, which is completely understandable, but it isn't a compelling need for others. The very senior fundraising director in the sector said to me a few months ago, it has taken me 5 years to help my organisation to understand that our case for support is not, we are this very eminent organisation. Our case for support is our meaning and our value. For us, companies exist to make money and to perpetuate themselves. Charities exist to address a need and a goal. So as David has said, absolutely focusing on what that purpose is, externally at least, because I don't want to contradict anything else that's been said about that need to support the staff team. I think that these things are in parallel. I think really focusing on that role and that relevance is so, so important. You know, we've got one venue that we're working with that's been talking about whether it can act as a food bank in this period. That's fantastic. You know, is that appropriate for everybody? Absolutely not. We've got an orchestra like City of London Symphonia who are really experts in mental health work and are really thinking about how they can use those assets and that knowledge at this time to help people who are having to self-isolate, something that we're all going to struggle with as the pressures on our mental health at this time. I would really point you to have a look at someone like the King's Head, who, an organisation that double stacks shows every night, suddenly being closed, is doing a Facebook Live broadcast daily that they are linking their continued capital campaign around. So really impressive responses, and often from very small organisations. Then in terms of moving from living your values into actually how you translate that to fundraising, as I say, I think we have to move from a transactional based fundraising system into an impact based fundraising system. Really understanding the value of your work, both intrinsically in value, the artistic value, and the instrumental value at this time is absolutely critical. And for me, there is an opportunity to some degree for organisations to reconcile these two elements, which are often being very disparate in their communications, with some people getting one experience and some people getting another. I think it is an opportunity through the communications to bring that into the round, perhaps for the first time for some people. Finally, I think the third tip really is, as I've said, is to plan that campaign, develop the messaging. What are you asking people to do and why? What are the aims of your campaign? What value will it bring to others, not just to you? Establish your tone of voice, your frequency of communication, and the contact medium. So I've had conversations with people who don't have a lot of contact with their donors at the present time, so only want to contact them once a month. Some people are going to contact them weekly or even fortnightly. It's really about thinking about in the round. And what I would like to see is really those communications from a fundraising perspective being something that lands in people's inboxes, if email is the communication method, that is a moment of joy and a moment of transformation, because for me that's why we're all involved in the cultural sector, and there is no reason why our fundraising communications can't be part of that process. For me, artistic directors genuinely feel better about fundraising when it's part of the artistic process, and it is a creative process in its own right. And so it seems to me that many of us have tremendous assets in our archives, clips, materials. When I started talking to people, people said, but we don't have anything. And then very briefly, of course, they find that they do. And I think really adding richness to a relationship will be so valued at this time. And again, that's particularly targeted at individuals. For corporates, I think they're really going to welcome the enhanced role of the cultural sector, which has been so much maligned in recent years. And I think that's really important. We don't know what's going to happen with the corporates, but we can position ourselves as a really important force in society here. I think in terms of trusts and foundations, I've been so impressed already by how they've come together. They've rallied and opened up their dialogue. I think, again, frequent but irregular communication, keeping them up to date is really important. Not feeling that you always need to have everything authoritatively answered, just being honest and treating them as your partners will be appreciated.
Great, thank you so much. Are there any, I love the tips. Are there any more don'ts? You know.
Yes, I mean, I think I'm just going to share with you, I think the worst example I've seen to date, which one of my clients actually shared with me this morning, which was COVID-19 is giving you a gift, which is absolutely extraordinary email. So there's a really obvious example. Be really sensitive to people's needs. Don't over bombard them. Make sure that you're adding that positive and warm element. I guess the big thing that I found really negative in emails is where people are just trying to sell me things or ask for money. It never goes down well. No, goes down well. I always say that I never ask for money. I ask for the change I'm trying to bring about. So again, I think that's really worthwhile following through. And I think just thinking about why you're communicating with people. I mean, I've had delivery companies email me to tell me that their deliveries will be sanitary. You know, I always assumed they were. So.
Yeah, I've just been wondering, I mean, we're missing Philippa Della in this conversation, HR Director at Freeze, and one of our consultants at People Make It Work. And unfortunately, she's no doubt managing a live HR issue right now. And, you know, I think all of us have been sensitive to the people profile in this conversation today. But one thing that I feel like we might be in denial about right now is the scale of harm, human harm, that might be coming. And at the moment, quite rightly, we're thinking about organisational health and sector health. Absolutely. And one of the reasons that we're able to even think that is that for most of us, we haven't been bereaved by this illness yet. We might know people who are unwell or feeling like they might be unwell, but we're still at an early stage in comparison with some of the projections. Yes. And I was wondering, from a fundraising and kind of relationship engagement perspective, whether there's a moment where we don't talk anymore about that mission for a while. Is there a time when we quieten ourselves, or is there always a place for our mission and the change we want to make happen, even at times when there may be thousands of deaths and, you know, therefore tens and tens of thousands of bereaved and anxious people?
Such a good question, Richard, and you ask it very clearly in a very hard-hitting way. I think that we plan a campaign that isn't just thinking about us because we're thinking about our purpose and our charitable objects. I think that, as has been pointed out by Kate, I think we have to remain alive to the situation as well. And the point of having a campaign is that you're going to continually review that and make sure that it's appropriate and address it. It's interesting, your question in a way reminds me of the sensitivities that we always consider around legacy campaigns. And I think the most important thing here is to really make sure that if we have that warm, intimate dialogue, that we're not overstepping the mark in that we are being respectful of our supporters, and equally that they're going to be able to say to us, please, this isn't the moment, I have to, you know, step away, of course. But I think the more human, as I think the word has been used, our dialogue is, the more it's positive and appropriate but sensitive it is, the better. Essentially, we want to be speaking to our communities. That's what we're doing. For me, philanthropy is a barometer of our relationship with our audiences. It's simply that. They are so close to us that they want to support us. That is how philanthropy works. And of course, there'll be moments where we might get that wrong, but if we're listening, as has been pointed out, and communicating well, hopefully we won't get it too wrong.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Caroline. I know that at some point you might drop off our top panel, because I know you've got a range of other...
I talked about, yeah.
Exactly. So thank you so much. Thank you to Katie's Philanthropy for contributing to this conversation.
Richard, I've just got one last thing I might add, if I might.
Of course, you may.
As you know, that we run a free fundraising workshop, which has been at the Old Vic till to date. We had to cancel the one on Tuesday, very sadly. We're going to be announcing this week that that's going to move online, and that equally, that's something anybody can attend, but equally we're going to set up surgeries for organisations that they can book as well, pro bono as well. So trying to do our best to support the sector, like all my colleagues here.
Thank you so much indeed. Now I'm going to bring Ms. Dinnan back into the limelight. Anna, you talked earlier about some of the, we talked about creating this air pocket, we talked about thinking how we could kind of get into that low power mode where we're not losing our resources. And you were talking then, I think, quite a lot from a kind of stabilization perspective. I know too that you have an innovation perspective as well. So I thought in this conversation, it'd be useful to hear what you might have noticed from the conversation so far, but then perhaps we could talk a bit about what through a Nesta lens, what these circumstances create as well as what they lose. So could we kind of explore some of those questions, if you wouldn't mind?
Yeah, if I may pick up on a couple of things that I would reinforce just off the basis of my experience, something that that Caroline was talking about in relation to dialogue with funders. And I know, having sat on the other side of that table and been one of those funders in these really, really difficult conversations, that honesty and transparency is really critical. You know, if you need to be in this together, and if you're holding back and not sharing the full picture, it's really not going to help. So as far as possible, and I know, you know, all of these relationships are deeply kind of nuanced, but yeah, I can definitely say from my perspective that that transparency of conversation is really important, and to bring it as soon as you can. Like holding it back and keeping it under the sort of table ultimately just puts the price tag up and makes it a great deal more complex to resolve. So I definitely say that. And the other thing, I worked with very wise Caroline Felton in my early days in stabilisation, and something she said really, really landed with me about managing change, managing recovery and all this kind of stuff, is that as individuals, we only have a certain quota of our kind of change points, of like how much we can absorb and take on at any one time. It's always stayed with me. It's like, if you're using this up in a personal sphere, because, and it goes for anxiety, I think, as well, is that if you're using all that energy and attention and emotion up in one part of your life, to have some spare for work or, you know, your artistic kind of pursuits and stuff, it's really, really difficult to kind of make it go round. And so as leaders, there's something even doubly difficult about self-recognizing when you yourself need to take care of yourself. You've only got so much to give the rest of your team. And so one of those things around taking stock is actually, what are your own support networks? What's the health of your own support framework, so that you can be as generous as possible over the long haul? Because as we've sort of said, this isn't a kind of quick burst. This is likely to need your energy and your time and your care and stuff over time. So I just think having in mind how many change points you're using at any one point, and can you restock, and you know, that I just thought it was such a wonderful way of putting it. It really helps me. So that, yeah. So on the innovation side, I have to say, you know, these are the circumstances in which innovation can thrive, when we can get to that sort of front foot kind of mode. And I would definitely reinforce, you know, all the things that my peers have sort of said around getting to the heart of what you do. And I often talk about kind of what's the value proposition, what is it you're offering to people? And I think there's a couple of things that is useful to bear in mind that have sort of been touched on, but maybe just pick up a bit more. So one is about splitting the activities that you deliver from the value that might create for the person, for the audience member, the user, however you like to talk about or name those kind of groups. So that might be about emotional value, like the possibility of connection. It might be around health and well-being and a sense of self. it might be intellectual, you know, some people like engaging on that kind of level. So really thinking about the different groups that you work with and the different forms of value that you offer. And I think that will help break up in your mind and sort of break open some of the thinking that's possible around, well, we used to do it as a live venue, but now we need to do it completely differently. And I love these ideas of, you know, I think this thing about what are the assets that we've actually got. And that's not just like spaces, but our talents and our skills and our passions and enthusiasms. You know, the idea of London Sinfonietta and the, you know, I think, you know, brilliant examples, exactly that. It's like, what have we got that we can put into play in a completely different way? I think opening up that thinking is really important. And the other part that maybe sometimes is a bit less sexy, but kind of really, really important, is think about how you structure the financial component of that. So it doesn't necessarily need to be on the same basis that you've been working on, like, you know, as a ticket exchange of a ticket for a space in a theatre. But there are so many different kind of forms of transaction or ways that you can generate that kind of value, whether it's like subscription or as a third-party aggregator or something, you know, so really unpack that set of possibilities alongside the actual kind of thing itself, if that makes sense. And just reinforcing this sense of your greatest offer will be when you identify what your greatest need, what the need of the people that you're trying to serve is. And it occurred to me, a lot of people have been talking about placemaking, you know, over the last couple of years. It's been a big theme in policy and in practice. And these lovely examples about food banks, and I've heard about a local delivery company here offering to deliver not just, they normally do furniture, but deliver food to the vulnerable people. It's that kind of thinking about actually, if our long-term goal is creating a sense of place, then what's the opportunity in that? How do we play, you know, make ourselves, you know, indispensable to our community, because we do have something that we can genuinely offer, notwithstanding, of course, all the real parameters about how many staff you've got to deliver it, whether broadband's functioning, you know, all of those kind of things.
Right, thank you. And would you, if we're thinking about kind of, Caroline talked about some top tips. I don't know whether you've shared your top tips already. I've certainly got a huge amount of value from the things that you have talked about, Anna, but do you have any more top tips for us at this stage in terms of, yeah, how we might respond tomorrow?
I suppose there's just one that's now and a couple that are for the future, actually. So one now is around this, I love David's, the way he's describing these kind of chunks, and I would absolutely reinforce this, like in the change planning kind of situation, to be able to break down a program of work into chunks is so important for us as people to be able to deal with what's ahead of us. So I think that's a really, really sound approach. And I'd almost sort of say, you know, other possibilities of like going into a sprint kind of setup. The point about this is that it gives focus at a time when it's really easy to kind of go off one. I notice myself like wanting to read the news all the time, or finding it just, I don't know, I'm, you know, struggling to stay focused with the work because there's just a lot on your mind. So maybe going into a sprint around a certain outcome that you're trying to create over a short period of time, like 2 weeks. The other thing about that is you've got to, as an organizational leader, is be thinking around what are the quick wins we can generate, because having wins is what helps people keep ticking through. So trying to think about how you can shape that into some realizable stuff for the near and now. The other thing just I've been thinking about in relation to my work is about positioning for the future. And I think there's two interesting things. One, I've been doing some work around capturing value for the arts sector. And we've been talking about it in economic terms. And there's something around using this awful opportunity where people no longer have access to cultural activity, to build our evidence base and to keep gathering the you know, the recognition that people are feeling about how important arts and culture are to their lives personally. Isn't going to be some amazingly powerful testimony, I think, and opportunity there. So just to think about what can you capture as you're going along in small but hopefully ways that are helpful in the long term. And then secondly, there's just the stuff around, sorry, I won't take long. I kind of share the optimism of other people around the potential for new models. I think, you know, we have this sort of thing where we wait sometimes for people to come to us, and this is an opportunity where we really can't do that anymore. And that's going to create some really interesting models. So it's about, when the time comes, do test and trial some stuff, but have it in mind as you learn to scale, if you may, whilst you're going along, because I think there'll be enormous potential in the period that follows. And if you are interested in testing and prototyping new forms of distribution, I'd love it if you got in contact with me, because I'd love to keep making the case to the partners that I've been working with at Nesta about why it would be really good to support that kind of work in the future. Right. But it'd be really helpful if people have ideas and thoughts about how they might do that.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Anna. It's been absolutely invaluable to have you with us today. I feel really privileged to be in this space with each of you, and the contributions and insight and wisdom. It's kind of slightly overwhelming. So thank you so much. And I'm now going to ask Karen Turner. Karen, if you could take the hot seat once more and help us to just think. I think you might have got some kind of 3 or 4 kind of final thoughts that you want to share before we hear from David and close. We might close a little bit after 3:30. But where would you like to take this conversation, Karen? I think you've still got your sound off.
Oh, sorry. It's been brilliant for me to be part of this panel. So I've loved listening to everybody, and I'm learning and acting and responding, as we all are, in the moment across everything we do. So I think, you know, you brought all of us together, you curated this panel in a way to ask us all and each of us to focus on different functionalities that we have professionally, whether as a consultant or as in a staff role. And, you know, so I'm trying to avoid too much repetition, but I'm very aware that you set me up, if you like, to talk about specifically the hard stuff of cash, functionality, protection of your business, protection of your charity. And so, you know, I'm very conscious that was my brief. So if I stick to that hard stuff for a second, the first point I would really want to stress is that it would be wrong for me not to say that for the leadership of many organisations, the #1 priority right now is financial safety. So we've all talked a lot about public safety, health and safety, but financial safety, financial provision, cash, governance, delivery planning, impact assessment, immediate change management that can keep your lines flowing. And for me not to stress that is our responsibility, I'm sure for many people in your audience today, our audience today, that's exactly what many of them will be worrying about. So the cautionary tale, with all the vision and inspiration around us, the cautionary tale is to say that the leadership, whether that's your executive staff, your board of a charity, has a joint and equal role to protect the charity in order to continue to service the beneficiaries. So I think that's the first point. So the second thing for me to say would be that to use this crisis, and this is what I'm sort of jointly spending time on, to use this crisis to actively help sharpen your purpose, the value, your offer, and the role that you have. So focusing your vision and mission and how that will manifest itself in the months, years to come. Going back to the core values and ethics of who you're there to serve, what you're there to create, and how they need you most. So for National Youth Theatre to step up and to quickly evolve, to continue to support the young people that we're there to serve. Our membership, whether in loneliness, whether in mental health crisis, whether they're just purposeless, floating, whether that's creatively, functionally, or indeed in a personal crisis. So we're actively trialing and have actively repurposed all of our directors, all of our creative teams, all of our creative associates from existing projects to consider digital solutions. And the hope there is about creativity. Our strapline is enabling young people to be part of something bigger. So how do you do that in a digital network? How do you do that differently when it's not on a stage or it's not in a community course? So be part of something bigger. How will that materialize, that future purpose, to allow creativity, vibrance, dynamism to flourish? So my third point is then to say that second point is really about very much trialing for the future and trialing for things that we don't yet know. The third point for us is about managing the existing pathways, the existing courses, programs, thinking about some of our vulnerable learners, how we can trial new learning modules for continuity, for protection of the courses that they're running currently, that they're part of, accredited courses that we run. So testing and prototyping new distribution models for existing programs. That's the third, that as distinct from the second. And then I think the fourth thing, really, the final thing, would be to say how everything we're doing in every way, whether financial, management, decision-led, is about considering the core purpose of the charity, the value of the National Youth Theatre, the impacts, the values we're known to have, the values we maybe don't yet know that we do have in terms of impact. How do we enable that to continue to flourish and to continue to be vibrant for those that need it probably now more than ever, actually? So yeah, final sort of stopping there, really, our sense of community.
Thank you. It's incredible. And I know that in a few minutes' time, you'll need to leave in order to, like so many people right now, take on a domestic role and support the family that so many people are surrounded by.
I'm aware there's going to be an announcement imminently about schools. I've got one closed, 3 still open. So yeah, that will affect many of us, I'm sure.
Of course. Thank you so much for contributing to this session, Karen. It's been absolutely incredible. I'd like to ask, I'm going to give David kind of the final word. I might sneak in a final word before we actually finish. But David Micklem, would you like to play back some of your thoughts on where this conversation's gone, and perhaps expand on what it is that artists and communities need from our arts organisations today at this time?
Well, thank you, Richard. Thank you for giving me the penultimate, if not the final word. And what incredible company to be with too. I'm sort of nodding feverishly here. I think everything that's been said is hugely valued and valuable. I think I've got 5 very quick points in less than 5 minutes, probably in 3. Maybe not that. I'm using up too much time already. So 5 quick points. And they're really picking up on things that other people have said, but they've really resonated for me. First is a point about leadership, and I think it was maybe Karen that said this, that we're not alone. We have colleagues in our teams that we can work in partnership. We have boards, trustees, we have peer networks, we have stakeholders, and I think as leaders, as many of us have said, we have a finite amount of energy in these moments, and I think to have a team around us bolsters that energy. And there are all kinds of ways in which we can feel the energy we get off other people. I put a tweet out earlier today to say I'm having a beer, and you come and join me for a beer virtually. It's a real beer, but in a virtual room at 8 o'clock tonight for anybody else who's working in the cultural sector who wants to have a chat. And the response has been incredible. I just think, I feel some energy for that, and I hope other people will too. So that was the first thing to say. Again, Karen said something that resonated for me about sort of letting go of old models. And the very wise Sarah Priest, who was the executive director with me at Battersea Arts Centre, used this phrase, you've got to let go to let come. And that really stuck with me, that as long as we're holding on to old models, we're not allowing the space to emerge for new ways of working to step in. So that feels very critical to me. The third thing, and those that have heard you heard me speak before won't be surprised to hear me talk about cultural democracy very briefly. I think more than ever, this is a chance for us as arts organisations to be culturally democratic and to really listen to the people that we exist to serve. And I've got a real world copy here. It's also available online on the 64 Million Artists website, 64millionartists.com/cultural democracy. Some really practical hints and tips here on how you engage your stakeholders and give them a greater sense of a stake in your organisations. And that feels even more pertinent at this particular moment. Two final points. One is, I think as leaders, we need to be engaged in cultural democracy and be engaging with our wider communities. But I also think there needs to be times where we are being authoritarian or dictatorial. And I think provided people know where we are at any one point on that spectrum between democracy and authoritarianism, I think everyone's on board with that. Okay, I've listened to all of your ideas and now we're going to go and do this for these reasons. Actually, this is a moment where I'm listening to everybody and what it is you want to do. And I think from my experience, provided people are really clear where you are, where we are on that spectrum at any one point, we're heading in the right direction. And then the final point, just picking up, I think, on one of maybe Anna's points around prototyping is, you know, back to the Arts Centre's methodology, Scratch, the idea that you kind of iterate things creatively through a series of feedback loops in partnership with an audience. Scratch can be adopted and adapted in all kinds of ways in all kinds of contexts. So I think that idea that we probably haven't got many of the answers at the moment, but through presenting them to our teams, presenting them to our stakeholders, our audiences, is an opportunity to build ownership amongst our communities, but also to improve our ideas. A fledgling idea is hugely improved through sharing it with others and inviting feedback. So I think coming to the table with that sense of, well, we don't really know what we're doing here, but we've got some nascent ideas, please improve them. It feels like a really good context to be exploring some of that stuff.
Thank you so much, David. It's been absolutely incredible to have you sharing your wisdom collectively in this session today. I'm sorry that we couldn't bring you Philippa Della from Freeze. Kate, Philippa, Anna, Karen and David all work with me at People Make It Work alongside their own individual amazing practice. And Caroline runs KT's philanthropy, as you heard earlier on. We know that we're at a time of extraordinary change. And I don't know about the rest of you, but I feel like it's a confusing and confusing and like unsettled moment. And I feel as often bereft and uncertain about what's happening, and equally, almost simultaneously, buoyed up and humbled and moved beyond words by the individual, the organisational, the national, the local, the human responses. And today we've witnessed some extraordinary generosity in sharing wisdom and insight with us. I humbly thank you for all of your time with us today. And I hope that this set of thoughts gets shared widely. We certainly will be making it available to our Change Creation cohort, our People Make It Work colleagues, and also on Thursday the 19th, it'll be linked into our arts professional article that's exploring some of these topics too. So I'd like to say thank you very much to all of you who've taken the time to watch this contribution, and to our wonderful panelists today who've helped us to navigate what seemed unnavigable only an hour and a half ago. So thank you very much to all of them, and we wish you the greatest luck with all your endeavours. Thank you very much indeed. And I'm going to close this meeting. Goodbye.